Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to begin by thanking all those members of this Parliament who signed my motion that allowed for this debate to take place today. Last year, I attended an event one evening in the Garden Lobby that was bringing together many elderly forum groups from across Scotland. As I spoke to many in attendance, I asked them what were the big issues for pensioners in Scotland. And I have to say, to my surprise, the issue of the cost of funerals came up time and time again. A few months later, I attended another similar event where the then Cabinet Secretary, Alec Neil, spoke, and in his speech he announced a review of funeral costs in Scotland to a very warm welcome and a very warm reception from those in the room. I'm pleased that Alec Neil is here this afternoon to participate in this debate, and I would want to acknowledge the work that he did to kick off a review and steer the work in the direction that I believe has made good progress. I brought forward this motion on the back of Citizens Advice Scotland report that highlighted the latest increases for cemetery and cremation charges across Scotland. The on-average increase this year of 8% for a burial and 11% for cremation. I do remember that I highlighted this issue when I was an opposition councillor in Fife Council, because the increase in local charges at that time over the 5 years were quite horrific, and yet Fife remains one of the lower cost areas for burial and cremation in Scotland. At the time, there was no doubt in my mind that the hikes and charges were directly linked to the cuts in council budgets. As we saw from the publication earlier this week from Spice and the University of Glasgow and Heriot-Watt University, cuts in public services disproportionately hit the poorest and those on the lowest incomes. This is also true for service charges, where people do not have a choice, have to access a service, and yet the costs continually go up. I would, of course, acknowledge that some councils have had to make significant investment, but the key point that I would ask we consider is, can it be right that those least able to pay are expected to bear the brunt of the cost to fund the future investment of cemeteries and crematoriums? Future capital investment must be met from general funding, as burial and cremation should, in my view, be considered a public service. As well as acknowledging the role of Alec Neil in taking these issues forward, I would also acknowledge the very important work of Citizens Advice Scotland in highlighting the levels of funeral poverty in Scotland and the work that they have done to offer solutions. It is worth taking time to emphasise what funeral costs can mean. For those on the state pension, it would take 7.5 months of their pension income to pay for the average funeral. For those on job seekers allowance, it would take 12 months of benefit to pay for the average funeral. Around 10% of people will struggle to pay for the cost of a funeral for which they are responsible. The average debt taken on by people in Scotland for funerals is £1,573, according to Royal London, who state that this debt is expected to rise in the coming years. The increasing costs of funerals has resulted in the gap between the contribution from the Social Fund funeral payment and the actual retail funeral cost more than doubling from 2004 to 2015, leaving claimants with an average shortfall of over £2,000. As the working group has said, if an individual is unable to pay the cost of a funeral, there is two possible outcomes. Either they take on a level of debt which may create distress that can interfere with the grieving process, or they seek to reduce the expense and provide less of a funeral, in which case guilt and stigma may interfere with the grieving. It is also a fact that the current DWP grant is described by Royal London as weak and flawed. Of the 66,000 applications to the fund in 2012-13, only 53% were successful. Families can end up in a lot of debt where they have borrowed thinking they will get support and then they are refused. Control over this part of social security will be with the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government, and while some elements of the new powers coming to Scotland will take time to set up, I am hoping that the Social Fund funeral expense payment can be transferred sooner rather than later, so that we can design a better system here in Scotland to support people when in need. I note that the government paper published last week to create a fairer Scotland highlights funeral poverty as the last action point 50, where they state we will improve the current system of funeral payments so it helps more people, is more predictable and provides help more quickly. This is welcome. I support this, and I hope the government can now put a timetable on when these powers will be transferred. The review by John Birrell and Fraser Sutherland has set out the detail of what needs to be done, and Citizens Advice Scotland has published further work on the social security powers so that we are well placed to move this issue forward. Presiding Officer, one of the first experiences of understanding poverty for me was when, as a child, I was in a graveyard and came across an area with no headstones and was told that this was an area of the paupers' graves. At the weekend, I watched the film I, Daniel Blake, and heard the term used, the pauper's slot, at the crematorium. I had thought that we had made progress and no one would be described as a pauper in 21st century Scotland. Let us agree today that we will bring forward a timetable, build on the good work that is being done and sort this issue out once and for all. I move.